Right, Prynhawn da pawb. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the expert session, Circles of Support. Croeso I sesiwn arbenigol Cylchoedd Cymorth. My name's Janet Radford and I'm Senior Officer Internal Services at PAVO. Janet Radford ydw I ac rwy'n swyddogion gwasanaethau mewnol yn PAVO, and I'm your host for this session. Before I formally introduce our expert speaker, Mark Williams, I would just like to introduce my colleagues who are helping to make sure our session goes smoothly today and go through a few announcements and housekeeping arrangements. David Darby's here to help with the technology, and we're very grateful to him for helping our session running smoothly. And PAVO's Powys Befriending Service and Manager, Diane Jones, is here with us to co-host with myself. Do you want to give us a wave, Diane? Thank you. And we have Jen Hawkins, our communications officer, with us, and she's here to help anyone who's having difficulty with the software. So without further ado, I would now like to introduce our expert speaker for the session. We're very fortunate indeed to have with us Mark Williams. Mark has worked in social care and community development since the mid-1980s. Having a younger brother with Down syndrome, he wanted a career where he made sure that individuals achieved their best life possible, at the centre of their communities and not at the fringes. He is currently working on a regional transformation programme in North Wales, where he also has set up a community interest company and cooperative called Flint Should Do It, where he works alongside members of the community and professionals to apply a whole range of asset-based approaches using co-production principles. He has recently gone back to using the circle of support approach, which he first pioneered in Wales with his brother Andrew in the mid-1990s. I'm really looking forward to this session. I'm sure you all are. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much for such a nice introduction. I noticed a couple of friendly faces joining us today. So Chris from Cartrevi, Grace, and obviously Claire. So good to see some friendly faces. Somebody else is operating the slideshow, so we might as well just jump into slide one. Okay. So just as an introduction to this, I've got a quote there from the Irish author, who I'm sure many of you will know, who says, "I honestly don't know how people can exist without friendship. People to share their secrets, hopes and dreams with. Also people who will share humiliation, shame and loss. Friendship need have nothing to do with coming from the same background and sharing all the same interests. A friendship can grow on the most unlikely and barren ground." And she indeed wrote a book, I believe, called Circle of Friends, that was made into a film. So yeah, I just wanted to, this session is about an approach called Circles of Support, but really it's about that universal topic, that theme of relationships and friendships. And I'll keep reinforcing the importance of that. It is a specific approach. It has been around since about 1980. There's a lot of people at the moment talking about innovation. I just find it quite interesting because most of the approaches that I'm using are at least 30 years old. Asset-based community development, circles of support, person-centered planning. These have all been around for donkey's years, but if it's good as far as I'm concerned. So if we just jump on to the next slide, please. So I pinched this slide from the local area coordination movement. Some of you may know about local area coordination. I don't know, it's a particular approach. It's another one that's been around for a long while. It came from Western Australia, and it's this idea of having a coordinator in each locality who gets to know that community really well and connects people up, not unlike, I guess, the community connector role in Powys, which I've learned a bit about by talking with Claire and some of her team members. But the graphic is what's important for me, because it's got the cliff. I'm guessing that this will resonate with all of us in the current times, that too many people are at the edge of that cliff, or indeed are falling over. You've got those ambulances waiting at the bottom there. Many people are ending up the doors of their GP practice, or indeed in hospital, or knocking on the social worker's door. They don't know what else to do, it seems, but a lot of the reasons that people end up in these places stems back to often loneliness and isolation, and people don't know what else to do. And we've got a crisis in health and social care, as we know. We're getting completely overrun by the level of need. Obviously, the pandemic has really impacted on this and shone a light on this area. Ironically, my stepdaughter qualified as a GP, as a doctor, during the pandemic. She was qualified early to help out with the crisis, and a couple of Christmases ago, she was home with us and she was poorly, and she rang the GP practice to get an appointment, and she counted how many times she had to call. It was 100 times. Now, if that doesn't tell you that the system's broken, I don't know what does, really. That's incredible, isn't it? We can't even get an appointment because there's so many people going to the GPs, often because they've got developed maybe a low-level mental health issue around being lonely, and they don't know where else to go, so they often end up on perhaps antidepressants or what have you. Another interesting thing in relation to care and healthcare and the NHS, I was fortunate in a previous job to work with the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Jones, and got to know him a little bit. And he came up and did some work with us in the GP practice in North Wales. And, you know, we've got a pre-prescriptions, haven't we? Which I'm sure most of you will agree with. But he was telling me at that time that that takes up nearly a half of the Welsh NHS budget, free prescriptions, which I thought was a staggering amount of money. And as we know, much of that literally goes down the drain. How many people have got medication piled up at home that they're not using? And so often when we hear the argument about the health service needing more money, I'm not quite so sure about that. We could maybe use it differently. Obviously, social prescribing that you guys are working on is there to sort of try and maybe divert people away from just taking a pill to feel better, to do something meaningful with our lives. So there's work going on. But another thing I'd want to point you in the direction of while we're talking about this topic is if you Google what makes a good life, you'll come across a TED Talks, and it's the longest study about what makes a good life. It's in Harvard University in America, and it's been going on for over 75 years. And it shows overwhelmingly that what makes a good life, the most important factor, is good, close, quality relationships, period, as they say in the film. You know, this information is as old as the hills, but why don't we spend enough time looking at enabling people to have really strong relationships around themselves? And just one other thing, one other reference that might be of interest to you, is that some people are suggesting that our welfare state and our health system is broken. There's an author called Hilary Cottam, Cottam, who's written a book called Radical Help. And it's talking about our relationship with the state and the fact that our welfare state is, well, whatever it is, 75 years old and needs updating and modernising. Anyway, enough of the politicising. We all know essentially that relationships are good for us, And that graphic is showing that we need to strengthen those relationships back from the cliff, so that people are looking after their own health with strong relationships around them. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just a sort of bringing together a number of things that we use and use together. So I mentioned Flint Should Do It was mentioned earlier on. That's a small community interest company that we put together because we felt that we could work across our communities together rather than in the silos that we sit in, i.e. learning disability, mental health, older people, children and young people, and so on. And this is the way that we work. We start with what's strong, what people have got, by using person-centered approaches, finding out what people have got for themselves, their skills, their interest, their story, which is an important part of that. We help people to build a really strong circle around themselves. And that's what this talk is about. Then we look at the community networks that people have got, the existing communities, the voluntary organisations, the activities that are going on in the community, before we finally get to paid services. And some people would suggest that often in some services in particular, we do that wrong way round. We look at paid support first, and then what happens is we can create a dependency on paid support. Whereas really what people need is a balanced life where, yes, if they need paid support, that's important to them, but that shouldn't be all of their life. When I made a film a few years back with some folk with learning disabilities and started talking with them about who their friends were, many of them were naming their support workers. And I would have to have an uncomfortable conversation with them. I'd say, are they really your friends? Do you see them outside of work? And of course they say no. I said, well, they are friendly support workers. They're not your friends. So often what we're doing is we're masking the fact that people haven't got many relationships around them. So we're suggesting we turn it inside out and we start with the person, what's strong, we build a strong network with them or do what we need to do to strengthen relationships, use the community, of course. And if people need a bit of extra paid support, that's fine. On this slide, there's a mention of a book that reinforces this. It's called Just Enough Support. And this isn't about letting the state off the hook, as some people have sometimes suggested. It's about that balance. It's about, as I said, if you need paid support, that's fine, but it shouldn't be your whole life. And then another reference on the slide, there is something called the enabling state. The Carnegie, I don't know if it's the foundation or the trust, have written many documents, and one of them is called the enabling state. And it talks about our role in terms of giving support, but then getting out the way, being a facilitator. And that's not an easy thing to do, but that's what we feel needs to happen if we're going to help people to have strong and healthy lives full of good relationships. Next slide, please. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Circles of Support. I mentioned earlier that it's been around since 1980. If you're interested in this kind of thing, you might Google Judith Snow. She's a young disabled Canadian woman who ended up in a residential home, mostly with older people. And she was going out to run a disability organisation in the day, but she would leave perhaps 8:30, and that would mean that she would miss breakfast, which was 9 o'clock in that particular place. And she may come home at 5 or 5:30, and dinner was 4:30. Over a period of time, as you can imagine, she became poorly and malnourished and on the point of collapse. She was lucky that she had two relatively close friends who saw what happened and basically helped her to escape and to help her to get her life back. And what they did was, with Judith's input, they invited together a wider group of people to help Judith to problem solve and work out what she wanted to do with her life. That was the first ever circle of support. I believe they called it the Joshua Committee. And not long after that, Judith and her friends, Jack and Marsha, worked together to share that approach with many others, and they formed an organisation called inclusion.com, which again you can Google, and they created a lot of person-centred planning tools that some of us are familiar with. Anyway, circles came over to the UK, Bristol, in about 1990, early 90s. And I went to an event in Bristol in 1994, and it was an event like no other. It wasn't a conference run by professionals for professionals. It was a community event where disabled people, alongside their friends and some professionals, shared this life-changing approach of circles of support. And I came back from that time. I was working in Cardiff. My job was to develop self-support networks around people moving out of long-stay institutions. And I just thought this circle approach has really got something to offer. Robert and Andrew were early Welsh pioneers I worked with. Andrew's my brother that was mentioned earlier, and I'll come back to that story a bit later on. I worked for the organisation Circles Network, who were doing this stuff at the time, and became their Wales coordinator for a period. And then later on in the early 2000s, I worked on something called the Life Options Project, which was a project around transition and person-centred planning. And it just so happened that a number of the families were helped to develop a circle of support. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And many of those people are still benefiting today. And also, just in terms of the sustainability of this approach, I should mention I've done some of these things online recently and come across other people I supported in the 1990s who are still benefiting. So this is an approach that really does take us beyond projects, and it can be life-changing. And then more recently, I moved up to North Wales 10 or 11 years ago, and the loneliness and isolation agenda was really developing, and it led to a strategy and a consultation and a strategy. And now I believe there's some funding out there to support that work. But I thought I need to go back to circles of support, and I started talking with people and started building circles again. And I'll tell you more about that shortly. Next slide, please. Again, some of you might have come across this work, but across the border in England, there's an organisation called Community Circles. Essentially, that is about circles of support. It's a little confusing that they've named it Community Circles, but if you look at what they're doing, it's helping people build circles of support. A lot of the work they're doing is around older people. So, for example, they partnered up with Age UK Doncaster, I think, and got 5-year lottery funding to build, I think, 300 plus circles around people in different situations. And there's some photographs there from their website. And we're now going to watch an animation that you can see on the Community Circles website that I think quite nicely summarises the approach. So I'm hoping we're going to be able to play and hear this film about Linda's story, an older person living with dementia.
Linda is generous, wonderfully kind and gentle. Linda's also living with dementia, and during Dementia Awareness Week at the local Carers Resource Centre, Kath met Alan, Linda's husband. They chatted about community circles and the support a circle could offer. Alan felt that a community circle could support Linda to live well with dementia and also offer him support in his role as carer. Kath, Alan and Linda met at Linda and Alan's home and chatted about what a community circle could specifically help them with. Using a relationship map, they identified the people in Linda's life who they could invite to the circle to talk about Linda's well-being. Alan shared their contact details with Kath, who got in touch with people by phone to invite them to the first circle meeting. At the meeting, Linda's family and friends gathered together over tea and scones to share happy memories of the time they'd spent with her. Kath facilitated focused conversations which helped the circle to bond together around a common purpose. The people at the meeting included some of their friends, their son, daughter-in-law and grandchildren who joined via Skype. In total, 9 people came together to form Linda's circle. The second circle meeting reflected on what was important to Linda, as well as what's working and not working in her life. One circle member commented that the conversation had brought issues up, made room for action, and now we know what to do that will make a difference. At this meeting, actions were developed to support Linda's well-being, and as a result, Linda is now volunteering at a local walking group. She loves the outdoors and walking and enjoys welcoming new members to the group. This gives her a valued role. The group reflects on what's working and not working in Linda's life at every circle meeting. Alan, Linda's husband, shared that he was struggling with the cooking. He said that it was a role that he had never done, and now that Linda's not able to do it anymore, he was finding it difficult. The circle members discussed ideas and decided to start their own version of a casserole club. This means cooking an extra meal a couple of times a month to support Linda and Alan to have home-cooked meals. The circle has supported Linda in her relationships and now having a volunteering role. It's also had an impact on all of its members. Linda and Alan have the support they need. Their friends know what they can do to help them, and other members of Linda's circle have also benefited as they feel that there is a sense of belonging through giving and connecting with each other.
Okay, so I hope that in a very short amount of time summarises what this approach is about. It's about using something called a relationships map, which we're going to come back to a bit later. You're going to have a little go yourselves at doing this. There are various versions of relationship maps, but ultimately what this approach is about identifying with the person. Obviously, this isn't something you do to somebody, you do it alongside them and with them, but helping them to very carefully look at their relationship map and to identify friendly faces and people that they could invite in together to help them with some thinking, planning and doing. Each circle is very different. Some of them will be just about the friendship and the informal side of it, but others will be maybe much more focused depending on what somebody's going through in their life or any changes they want to make in their life. But the mapping process is done very carefully. It's not done in 5 minutes. It's a bit of a detective story looking back over time. But I would argue that it's well worth it. What we do often see, obviously with some of the people we support, is that actually some of their inner circles are empty, and therefore our job is to try and find people who can move into that space. But what's key about this is the invitation. It does not just magically happen. It relies on an invite, a personal invite. You're not talking about Parvo-headed paper. You're talking about a personal invitation from the person and or their family to invite people into their lives, to listen to them and give a bit of friendly, informal support. Our experience is that when people are asked, they respond. This is a map of Tristan's circle. He was one of the young men I worked with on the Life Options Transition project I mentioned earlier. His map didn't look like this when we started out, but this is how it looks now. It's a very rich and diverse network of people who are now in his life. If you are so interested in this, you want to hear more from people themselves. Marie, who's Tristan's mum, who you see there as Mam, is very, very good at articulating how this works and the benefit to Tristan and his wider family. She's passionate about it, and she did some talks with me last year, well, this year, in fact. She's also a Welsh speaker, if that's of interest to you or the communities you're working in. So I'm just putting that out there, that the network of people that we work with are willing to help to share this approach. And she really brings to life Tristan's story in a way that I couldn't. But that's what his relationship map and his circle looks like now. So if we jump on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that I'd moved up to North Wales, and I hadn't actually, for whatever reason, been doing a lot of circle building in recent years. But I got approached. I spoke at a conference, not just about circles, about a bunch of things, but circles was mentioned. And I had a mum come up to me at the end of the session, almost in tears, saying, "Please help us, myself and my son. We're in dire straits." She said, "I have bipolar. I suffer from bipolar. My son is on the autistic spectrum and has also got massive anxiety issues, to the degree that at the moment he can't leave the house because he gets physically sick." Now, this is a young man who's very able in many ways. He's a car driver. He has a car on the drive, but he can't go out because he's completely disabled by his fears and anxieties. Mum's also poorly, and when I go to see them at their home, I can see this very, very negative codependency. Just the two of them living at home. There was a point where his mum was getting upset, Tom went to hug her and she pushed him away. They weren't in a good place. Mum was ended up frequently hospitalised, leaving Tom on his own, and he was just trapped. So we just used the relationship map to see if we could identify a few people to bring together. And Tom invited those people together with Mum's help, but he mostly did it himself. Mum was still racked with this idea that nobody would turn up, even on the evening of the get-together. But two other people showed up. One was her sister, and one was a guy from church. Tom had stopped going to church, but they had a good relationship. The next get-together, another person came from church and another sister came. And this is the way that these things grow. It's not about numbers of people, it's about quality. Who's going to come? And I said my experience is that people will come. I've been doing this since 1994. I've never known a situation where no one's come. And what the pandemic has shown, if we reflect upon it, is if there's a crisis, the people will come. The neighbours and the people who've been mobilised during the pandemic to support others, new volunteers. We've had an army of volunteers. And what that tells me is if there's an invitation, people will come. Now, circles isn't necessarily about crisis, but Tom and his mum were certainly in a bad place. But the point is invitations. And all of the people we talk to who become part of circles say, well, what's the big deal? I'm a neighbour or a friend of the family, or I just needed an invitation, because these days people are worried about treading on toes, etc. But our experience is if you identify the right people, they will come. And that's certainly the case with Tom and his mum, Sarah. In fact, Tom is now pursuing his ambition of becoming a truck driver. he's passed the stage 1 of the HGV test. He comes out and he co-trains with me. Well, he invited himself, actually. He said, "What's this you're doing, Mark?" I said, "I'm sharing the circles approach." And he turns up. This is a guy who hadn't left his house. And he got up and he spoke in front of people and introduced himself. And I was astonished. The transformation in a few short months. So he does that with me now, part of the team. Sarah, a byproduct of this, his mum, who, if you remember, I was saying was hospitalised quite frequently, started to go out swimming, quit smoking, started volunteering with Home Start. And I caught up with her last Friday because I've seen on Facebook, because she's got a doctorate. She's just written her first book. And she's got 5 others in the pipeline, including one she's co-writing with Tom. And when I case studied this, I worked with them over a 9-month period. I put in 30 hours, which is not a lot of time and not a lot of money if you want to equate it to support and facilitation. So if you move on, I'll update you with some of the other work we've been doing recently in North Wales. If we can move the slide on, please. So these are some images from, we managed to get a small amount of funding through a transformation programme in North Wales. That's our Do It logo. The picture below is actually of my brother with his circle of support. And the black and white one is of Judith Snow, the Canadian woman who I mentioned, who originated all of this stuff with some of her circle. And we sort of rebadged the circle approach and we called it the I-Team, just I suppose in an attempt to modernise it. But essentially building circles of support. We got the funding in the January 2020, pandemic hit. The plan was to run a series of informal workshops around North Wales, teaching people about how you do this. So we had to take it online and we all had to learn very quickly. So I learned about Zoom with the help of some friends. And instead of 4 face-to-face workshops, we ran 10 one-hour circle building sessions where we walk people through the process. At that point, I really wasn't sure whether that was going to work, the whole just doing it all online. But it certainly did. So if we move on to the next slide, please. This is a screenshot of some of our early gang, where we're looking at circles. Tom, who I mentioned earlier, is at the bottom of the screen, giving a wave in the center there. And so, yeah, we took it online and we had those gatherings. Our second course, we ran slightly shorter, 5 or 6 sessions. But now we think if we're going to do this again, it probably would be 6 to 8 sessions. And we ran mentoring sessions in between, which we'd often do on Zoom to help people to get going. And get going they did. So if we move on to the next slide. So these are some photographs of the relationship map, which we're going to come to in a while. There's a young lad whose family became part of the project, and that's the way that they were doing their relationship map. They were almost like a piece of artwork and photographs. Someone else did a slideshow. Someone else who's working with a young man who was into floristry, they did their relationship map in the form of a flower. Someone else who was into cricket created like a cricket pitch. He was the batsman, the supporting fielders, and so on and so forth, and the spectators on the outside. So the whole point of this is going back to something I mentioned earlier, person-centered planning. It's not about one template or one approach. It's about working with the individual in terms of what's going to work for them, not imposing things. So this is just to give you an idea of the range of ways that people look at their relationship map. So if we jump on to the next slide, please. So this, this was the point where I was thinking, oh my God, is this going to work online? And these are snippets from people's actual first circle of support get-togethers on WhatsApp, Zoom, and so forth. But you will see in that photograph at the bottom is a woman with Down syndrome who went very old-fashioned, you might say, and she sent out invitation cards to the people she wanted. So this idea of personal invitation, that's what it's about. It's personal. Excuse me. Okay, if we jump on to the next slide. So this again is just going to give us a flavour of some of the things that people are getting up to. So as I said, circle of support there's so many different things, operates in different ways. These are some of the things that people were talking about. Planning trips, holidays, hot air balloon trip was one of the individual's ambitions. Pamper nights in with the girls, football quizzes. Somebody was starting to look at whether they wanted to move on and have a new home. Somebody was talking about finding a new job. And some people were just talking about making more friends and connections. Well, the person who was talking about getting a job did indeed get a job, because part of our transformation program, we launched another approach, which is about getting out of social isolation, called gig buddies, matching people up with people with shared interests in terms of music and theatre and going out together. Well, Heather, who's one of the people who's on this project, she got the job as a gig buddies coordinator. Excuse me while I take a sip. And then if we move on to the next slide, you'll see a visual picture of, some of you may have heard of Fran O'Hara, who works for something called Scarlet Design, and they visually record things. Well, we were coming to the end of our iTeams project, so we got people together. We had a bit of a celebration, and it was very informal. It was online, but we had music, we had a band playing, we had a sing-song together, but we also talked about what we'd learned over the last 9 months and what some of the benefits were. You may not be able to see this because it's just on your screen there and it's too small, but we can share that with people. But people, in terms of outcomes, are talking about the fact that their circle was giving them voice and control, which is obviously, as many of us will know, one of the main principles of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. It's very definitely enabling people to have stronger relationships where they feel more supported, and community members who became involved felt more connected to the individuals. I think we had, I don't know what the numbers are, but over across the 9 or 10 or so circles, we had 60 community members involved. People were experiencing positive change, taking part in things, getting out and about as far as they could at that time. They had what they called an outcomes active plan in place, where they were looking to the future, but they were in control of that plan. It wasn't something that was being done to them. And they were all reporting improved well-being, feeling much happier knowing that their circle is there. One of the guys I mentioned earlier had did his relationship map in the form of a flower, now meets monthly on a Saturday afternoon, with including family members who are all spread all over the world. And he tells them about what he's doing, and Mum was astonished that he started talking about his future. He's still in school. So people begin to feel that with this support, they really do have that voice. It's almost like having your own self-advocacy network. You become empowered because people are caring about you and they're listening to you. And so, yeah, it amazed me that we managed to do this, but we did it. we created actually between 10 and 14 circles. We worked out that in terms of the cost is less than £500 per person. We are working, exploring with people the idea that you could use a direct payment to pay for some support to build a circle of support, which wouldn't cost a lot of money. And we're in discussion with various local areas at the moment. We just had a project approved in Pembrokeshire where we're gonna do this. So that the interest is really picking up. If we just move on to the next slide, I'll tell you about some other developments. So on Anglesey, as part of their social prescribing, community connecting agenda, they invited me in a couple of years ago to do some training with their team. So they have, I'm not sure how many, say 10, what they call local asset coordinators who work on the ground within communities. And they now see the circular support approach as, if you like, a part of their toolkit. When I was getting invited to do some talks recently, I went to a national conversation that's called the Resourceful Communities Partnership and spoke about circles. And Lindsay, who heads up this team, came along to show how you can embed this approach alongside your social prescribing and community connecting, or even your befriending work. And if we just move on to the next slide, I won't go into detail, but this is a case study that they shared where they're working with a woman in her 40s who they discovered actually her main issue was she was very, very isolated. She didn't mix with friends from work. Her husband was away a lot of the time working. And so her map, the map you see on the left is the relationship map they did at the beginning when they were chatting to Fran, I think her name was, who was in a circle. They did some work with her to connect her into various things and to look at were there other people who she could invite in closer. And then on the right hand side, you see what her map looks like now. And so for us, this relationship map is it's a well-being assessment tool. If you do a relationship map and you've got lots of gaps, particularly in those inner circles, it suggests that your health in terms of good relationships isn't as good as it could be. And then over a period of time, as with Fran's circle there, you can show that she's got more active relationships in her life, which means that she's stronger, she's emotionally stronger, she's more resilient. Excuse my language, but she said, I now got people I can share my shitty texts with. I've got people who will listen to me, whatever I say. So if you're interested in that side of it, in terms of connecting work, I've got some allies within the social prescribing world who are actively using this. If we move on to the next slide. Okay, and if you click the button, so we bring in the circles. So this is the Growing in Relationships map. And now what we'd like you to do, I believe that you were sent this map, perhaps this morning. I'm not sure about that, but yeah, I think it wasn't long ago. We would like you to have a quick 10-minute go at filling in your relationships map. Now, if you see what it says there, the anchors, the inner circle are those who love us. So you're writing the names of people in there. Now, those who love us might not automatically just be family. So don't just put family if it's not the case. My sister and I aren't that close, and I wouldn't put her in that circle. I'd maybe put her in my allies circle, the next circle is there, those who like us. So, and then the next circle is associates, those who recognize us. So these are perhaps some of the friendly faces that we come across in our street, in our neighborhood, in the places that we go to, be that church, the shops, the pub, the yoga group. But again, instead of, you're not just listing the yoga group, you're thinking of the name of, are there one or two people there who I consider a real friendly face? And then the paid relationship section is obviously those who provide service to us. You know, that's our motor mechanics and our bank managers and our dentists and excuse me, some of us may have other types of paid support in our life. Some of us might have a social worker in our life, you know. And then right on the outside there, it says those we've lost touch with who are off the map. So that's about thinking about maybe if you've moved or you've moved jobs or you've lost touch with people, who are those people who potentially you could get back in touch with? Oh, that's very strange, because I'm looking at one on my desktop that hasn't got that on it. So just before we open up for some questions, just wanted to finish off with a couple of things. This is my kid brother, Andrew, and he has got an absolutely great life, and he's had a circle of support since the mid-1990s. He's got a massive network of friends now. The picture in the centre is of a regular Saturday night, well, perhaps before the pandemic, but him dancing with the girls on the table. There's a company called Hijinks that wrote a play about my brother's circle called Full Circle, which toured the UK twice. And one of the things that Andrew achieved amongst many was he went to the Himalayas as part of an outcome, a rather major outcome, with the support of his circle. He told us he wanted to move into his own place, which he'd never said before, and he achieved that. And has been living in his own place now for over 10 years. And he works as a tyre fitter and just recently celebrated 30 years in the same job, which is a very rare occurrence for somebody with a learning disability. And the members where he works is in the tyre fitting company. They are natural members of his circle of support, the boys from the tyre fitters. And the other thing to say is when Andrew ended up poorly, he had a couple of nasty bouts of pneumonia and was hospitalised. It wasn't just his family who were looking out for him. It was a huge array of friends that he now has who were saying, "Where's Andrew? What's happened? How is he?" So, you know, this is if we do it well enough, this can really make big differences to people's lives. It is universal. It can work for anyone in any given situation. But I've got great faith in it. But it's one of these approaches that's simple in concept, but maybe sometimes difficult to do because it involves that inviting, if you like, that positive risk taking. But I would say that's definitely a risk worth taking, because what's the opposite? If we don't support people to build stronger networks, they're going to actually get ill sooner and die younger. That's the evidence. If you have poor social networks on your well-being, it has an impact. In the study I mentioned earlier, 75-year study, that's what it says. Those who live longest and happiest have good quality relationships. So just to finish, I think there's one more slide. We'll see. If Tom was here, Tom, who I mentioned in the story, one of his stories, he would finish on the mic with this: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And that's a Margaret Mead quote. So we can end the slideshow there, and we can perhaps have a chat, see if there are any questions or particular comments, whatever people want to say, really. So I'm reliant on the Parvo guys helping with this. Go on.
Thank you so much, Mark. I mean, it seems like the invitation to join a circle to me is the invitation to transformation, not just for the individual at the centre, but for every single person involved. I found that incredibly interesting and inspiring, and I'm sure that we probably have got one or two questions because we have got a bit of time. I'll hand over to my colleague Diane, who will invite people to ask you questions or make comments.
Thank you very much. Yes, just to echo Jan's comments there, Mark, that was incredibly interesting, especially from a befriending service perspective. It's definitely given me food for thought. Can I just invite members, if you do have any questions, to pop them in the chat pane, please, and then we'll come to you and invite you to ask your questions and put them to Mark directly, if I may. We do have a question from Sue. I wonder if you'd like to put that question to Mark, Sue.
Hello, Mark. I found that really, really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that. I saw that you had a slide with a young lad. I guess he might have been 9 or 10. Have you used this circles of support with younger children?
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of personal experience, but in the early days of Circles of Sport, I was working over in Nottingham, of all places, and yeah, worked with a number of younger children with autism. As I remember, a young lad called Yoshi, who was in had quite complex needs, but he was in a mainstream school, and they were concerned that he wasn't kind of integrated enough, and they were just wanting a bit of support to plan the future. So they developed a very successful circle of support. And the other thing I want to mention is I mentioned Nottingham, and some of the people there were involved in this. There's an organisation called Inclusive Solutions, and they're a pair of ex-psychologists who set up that organisation, and they use the Circle of Friends approach exclusively. They use it in schools and with vulnerable families. So if you look them up, you see a whole bunch of stuff there. But I strongly believe this is a universal approach. My wife is a deputy head, or she's been an acting head in a primary school. She's working in an area of real deprivation, and we're seeing lots of families where, you know, this whole agenda around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is impacting or could be impacting. I would see that building a circle with some of those families could be a preventative move, so they got those stronger networks around them. So very definitely this can be used in any circumstance. Folk with terminal illness, I remember the original video on Circles of Support when I started with Circles Network, they were featuring that whole range of stories. Anybody who needs a little bit of extra support, you know, the concept is the same. It's about using that relationships map and carefully inviting people in. I think if you look on the Inclusive Solutions site, you'll see how that works within the school setting as well. So yeah, I would say definitely.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sue, for your question. Mark, we do have another question from Linda Rogers, and I'll hand you over to Linda now to ask your question. Thank you, Linda.
Hi Mark, thanks for that presentation. Great to hear that Tom is doing so well. I had the pleasure of seeing him at the Metropole with yourself a couple of years back. Yeah, have there been any issues or concerns with the invitations being issued to join the circle for friends or neighbours or who possibly could be seen as unsafe friends or associates, those who wouldn't necessarily pass a DBS check, and how would that be handled?
Well, in my experience of building circles in Wales since 1994 is we don't DBS check anyone. And in fact, when I remember after we built my brother's circle, we interviewed people who'd been invited in and said, if we'd asked you to CRB, as it was then, to do a CRB, what would your response be? And they said, one of them said, I would have told you to get stuffed, because I don't want to be a traditional volunteer. I'm a friend of the family who's offering some support. Now, obviously, you might say that that's just somebody saying that, you know, but people are very carefully, when you do the relationship map, you do that very carefully. you don't invite people into a one-to-one. You invite them together as a group. So in a way, that's the kind of policing that goes on. And, you know, even in Andrew's circle, he knew all the people who were in his circle. He knew that he was just inviting them in closer, but they got to know each other better as a group, and then started making some individual offers. And we were all confident about that. And I think if we weren't confident, somebody would have said. So, and I would actually argue that, well, what is a DBS guarantee? I mean, I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to some bad situations that have happened, obviously, and people are more nervous than ever about vulnerabilities. But I would argue if you do this carefully, you're actually making people safer. So my brother's got eyes and ears around him everywhere, whereas previously didn't. He just had somebody, you know, he's in supported living, and he might have an inspector come in once a year. That doesn't guarantee any kind of safety. What does is having eyes and ears around you. What I will say, though, is I mentioned community circles in England. They recruit a volunteer circle facilitator, and they DBS check that person. So they've taken a slightly different tact on this, but I don't know of any stories where this has gone awry. As I said, I would argue that most people are actually, they're empowered and they're safer. I would argue it's a really good way of keeping people safe, but also empowering them and giving them those friendships they deserve. So it's not, you don't just put an advert in a shop window, friend wanted. That's the relationship map is so crucial, and it is people who are normally known to the person and the family, and it kind of vets itself, if you get what I'm saying. It's not come in and go out with somebody. It doesn't work like that. It's very carefully constructed. There is a kind of process to it. You could say it's social engineering, but sometimes with people we have to do the intentional community building, as we call it, before the natural can happen, because some people need that bit of extra help. But it is done carefully. It's not haphazard. So I hope that answers some of your question, but that is a common question, obviously.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Linda. We have had another question, which I'll put to you directly, if I may, Mark. What support helps keep the circles going?
I mean, obviously that's down to the facilitation process. So what we're doing an hour session today is just a quick, this is what a circle is. We do at least a day's training, or we break it down over several sessions. So we're making sure that facilitation includes thinking about the future, keeping the circle strong, sharing roles so that it's not dependent on one person, which is often what happens with stuff. Even if you think about yourself, Diane, with befriending, which is often a one-on-one, if that relationship ends, the person's maybe left alone again. So this tries to spread the support, and it's got some organisation to it. But the other thing that we did, and we are doing now in North Wales, is trying to build a loose infrastructure around it. So we invite the circles together to share their learning, celebrate their stories, explore any issues there might be, and consider whether extra training is needed. So we used to call those circles gatherings, and they were very informal, and they were co-run by circles of support and their members. So that was the kind of way that we built a community around those circles, and I would advocate that kind of approach, really.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. We do have time for just one more question, and I can see Martina's popped that into the chat. Thank you very much for that. Martina, would you like to put your question to Mark?
Yeah, from a personal point of view, excellent talk, by the way. You're definitely talking my language. I used to be a volunteer for home visiting for lonely people, so I do very much know what you're talking about here. But from a personal perspective, I am an immigrant from the Netherlands. Although I've lived here for over 40 years, all my family still lives in the Netherlands. So you do lose a lot of touch with family over that length of time, and it becomes definitely much more distant. So what do you do in such situations? There are many immigrants in this country who may be in a similar situation. And I'm quite an introverted type of person who's not comfortable in large groups, especially from people I don't know absolutely intimately. 2 or 3 people personally would be more than enough for me. How do you deal, because I don't feel that your model, it's not one size fits all. There are people from all sorts of different characters and circumstances. So I'll just present this to you as an alternative. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be people, won't there, definitely, like you're suggesting, who've got a very small circle, if you like, who've not got many contacts, or like moved abroad or moved away. Then it might be more difficult. But I think it's just working with that person, looking at their relationship map, definitely not forcing a circle upon people if that's not what they want, because you might not want one. But I suppose trying to work with people to say, are you happy with that situation? Do you want to change it? There might even be some steps before or while we're doing the relationship map to look at, do you want to make some more connections in the right kind of way that work for you? Like you say, small gatherings. All I know is that for those who say they want to explore this approach, there's never nobody there. Even if it's one other person, that's one more, isn't it? And often the way that these things build are almost one by one. I mean, Tom and his circle started with 2 people come in. It grew a little bit. I don't think he wants his to be too big, to be honest. He likes it quite small. He's in control of it. So I think it's horses for courses. It's about working in a way that's going to work for the person. And they've got to want it to work, I guess, because the circle is ultimately controlled by you. It's not a service. It's about working with you to say, well, what do you want out of this? Obviously, with Zoom and video conferencing that some of us got used to now, you can have a circle that's international, meet people online, but it's person-centered. It's going back to that point which you'd already made, really. But circles don't have to be big. It's not about the number of relationships, it's about the quality.
I agree.
Definitely.
Thank
Lovely.
you.
Thank you very much for that. I don't think we've got any more questions at the moment, but if anybody has got anything that they would like to ask Mark, please pop them in the chat pane, and they'll be picked up and responded to at the end of the session, and will be sent out to you. We've just had a question from Phil. I don't know if that's something that you can answer quite quickly, Mark. Otherwise, we can pick it up and send it out after the session.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, as I said, during the COVID anyway, we have seen more participation in many ways in our communities, haven't we? Because people need help and people have gone looking to support people. All I know is, as I explained, running this circles online and on Zoom, we again had no trouble getting people involved in circles. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily increased, but I think the challenge is just different. But I think the pandemic has definitely shone a light on the fact that too many people are isolated and that relationships are important.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say, like, in terms of people's perception changing, in terms of sort of being proactive in supporting people and coming out to trying to, with you saying lost connection. So I was trying to be, it was a positive sort of comment as opposed to a negative, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think, more people are coming forward, and I think that is a positive, isn't it? We're seeing more people mobilised and more people recognising the importance of this stuff. I think that's one of the reasons I've been asked to do more of these, because there's an interest in it, and most people do want to support their neighbours. They just need an invitation.
Yeah, sorry, thank you.
Thanks for the comment and the question.
Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much for that. We'll hand back over to Janet now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Diane, and thank you very much to you as well, Mark. You've given us a terrific amount of food for thought. It's very clear that from very small beginnings, huge changes for the better can be achieved for people. Today, we've all had an invitation to transformation, and I think this is definitely something for us to think about, possible projects for us here in Powys going forward. thank you all so much for attending this session. I have learned a terrific amount, and certainly the exercise, self-reflection, is quite revealing. I'm sure we've all learned something about our own circle of friends and connections doing that. If you've enjoyed this session and found it useful, please let other people know on social media using the hashtags, hashtag Pavo Conference 2021, hashtag Cynhadledd Pavo 2021. And thank you once again to Mark and to my colleagues Diane, David and Jen for helping us. I've just spotted there's a hand up with Sue Newham. Do you have something you want to say before I close the session, Sue? You're just in time then.
You do, I do, because I really wish that I had been to this session before the planning for the loneliness and social isolation session that's on Wednesday. But that's going to be encouraging third sector organisations to get together and have some joint ideas about projects that might help with loneliness and social isolation. Now, if your organisation is in that position, then and you're not signed up, it would be a good idea to sign up to come.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you. And if you want the ability to book onto that, if you go to the front page of Pavo's website, you'll be able to click into the booking form straight away and sign up for that. So thank you once again to Mark. Thank you all for attending. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Mark.